Hello everyone, FPL Raptor here and welcome back to another video on my YouTube channel. FPL is back after the international break, and in today's video we have my Game Week 9 preview. If you are excited for FPL to be back and the content to be back as well, please make sure to drop a like on the video, make sure to subscribe as well, but without further ado, let's jump into it. So guys, we are now approaching Game Week 9, which means we've had 8 game weeks of data to now look at. And whatever you think about expected data, I'm not saying that it's an absolute godsend and it's the thing that you must trust, but it does give you a bit of an idea about the players that are accumulating chances and are creating chances as well. So what we've got here for the first 8 game weeks is total expected goal involvement. Now, the reason I'm looking at total expected goal involvement, whereas I usually look at per 90 stats, is I also want to see sort of the total accumulation, because it's very important that the player is also on the pitch for a large amount of time. For example, someone like a Darwin Nunez has incredible per 90 data, but he's not on the pitch for 90 minutes every single game, and therefore he is arguably not as great of an option as some of these other players. So I'm actually going to look at total XGI here as per Fantasy Football Hub over the first 8 game weeks to just have a bit of an idea about which players are performing well, at least with respect to accumulating chances and creating chances as well. Now, if you are unaware, expected goal involvement is simply expected goals plus expected assists. So it's the combination of goal threat and creativity. And there are just a few things that I wanted to mention here today. The first, Salah is catching up with Haaland so far this season. So Haaland is on 8.41 XGI and Salah is on 8.1. So before, a couple of weeks ago, Haaland was still up at about 8, but Salah was down at sort of 6 or 5. In recent weeks, Haaland has accumulated barely any data. Since Rodri got suspended, Haaland is just not accumulating chances. He's not getting them and he's not creating them. Whereas Salah's had a really good few weeks. Obviously, we know last week, for those of us that captained him, he had an exceptionally good week. So Salah is now up there with Haaland. And this just goes to show they are probably both worth owning, but you could definitely justify, if you can only have one, especially with the fixtures coming up, that Salah may well be worth the one going for ahead of Haaland. But again, in an ideal situation, if you can, both is probably the smart play at the moment. We're not going to talk about the midfielders too much here because there is a section later in the video where I'm going to talk about the midfielders in a lot of detail, and I'm going to try my best to give you the ideal midfield 5 to own at the moment, or at least in my opinion, who is the ideal midfield 5. But just to note, if you look at this in the top 10, which is sort of the left-hand side of the graphic, we've got Salah, Saka, Mbeumo, Fernandes, Maddison, Son, Bowen. So 7 of the top 10 are midfielders with only 3 forwards. If you sort of remove Haaland, because obviously he's a very straightforward pick if you've got the money to do so and you want him, and very expensive, it's actually only Jackson and Isak that enter that top list there. So this just goes to show it's probably worth investing a lot of your budget at the moment into the midfield slot, because these are the players that are accumulating most of the chances. And on top of that, they get the extra point for a clean sheet and they get the extra point for a goal as well. And they tend to be pretty good for bonus points. So there's a lot to like about midfielders. And it's one of the reasons why, regardless of what wildcard draft I went for, whether that was a draft with Haaland or whether that was a draft without Haaland, the midfield seems to be where the value is at. And that is often the case in FPL. So this would just confirm for me that you probably do want to be in a 3-5-2 wherever you can, with a lot of your money invested in the midfield. But we are going to discuss all the midfielders in more detail, but the sort of usual culprits are up there. Saka, Mbeumo, Fernandes as well. Isak I'm going to discuss in a second alongside Wilson, because Isak and Wilson, when they're on the pitch, their data is exceptional. And even given the fact that Isak hasn't had perfect minutes to start the season, he is still 5th on this list. So Isak deserves some consideration. Jackson's fixtures coming up just aren't there to really select him. If we move sort of further down the list, obviously you can see Doucouré there, a player, that is Everton's Doucouré, by the way, that is just accumulating really high XG, sitting at about a 0.47 XG per 90. So if you're looking for a cheap player, I certainly don't mind him. Watkins is there at 4. Now, Watkins has, I think it's 9 attacking returns with about a 4 expected goal involvement. So Watkins is massively overperforming his expected data, but you can still see he's in sort of the top 15 for expected goal involvement and still is a fantastic player as well. The only defender in the top 20 for expected goal involvement is Matty Cash, who has exactly the same expected goal involvement as Neto, Watkins, Matoma, Alvarez. So Matty Cash, for me, this just goes to show, would be absolutely essential on a wildcard. And if you've got a free transfer and you don't own him and your defense isn't looking perfect at the moment, I do think Matty Cash would be my first priority, especially from game week 10. The fixtures are just so good for Aston Villa. Not necessarily long term, but short term to medium term. So Matty Cash would absolutely be towards the top of my list. And then you've got the likes of Morris and João Pedro down there. If you are looking for a cheaper forward, they have been accumulating a little bit, but Morris isn't playing in the best team. And João Pedro's minutes aren't as secure as you would maybe want them. But I myself, believe it or not, some of my transfer plans have included the possibility of bringing João Pedro in around Game Week 10 or Game Week 11 if his minutes look a little bit better, because his data is good. He's on penalties, and Brighton have exceptionally strong fixtures. So we will reapproach the idea of João Pedro soon, but for now, maybe not someone you're necessarily considering. So this just gives us a bit of an overview about the players that, based on the data, we would have expected to do well. It also gives you a bit of an idea about why potentially a lot of managers have been struggling in this first 8 game weeks, because the likes of Mbeumo, who performed well at the start, but then has since been underperforming his data a little bit. Fernandes and Rashford on this list as well. A lot of people have had Jackson in their team and Eze. So you can see that a lot of the players that the data would suggest should be performing haven't necessarily been getting the output that we would expect. And that then raises the question, of course, is data unreliable? Like, should we just disregard this? A lot of people say expected data is pointless, or this just goes to show that expected data shouldn't be used. I don't think so, because in previous seasons and across historical data, it does roughly correlate that if a player gets chances, i.e. they have high expected data, they will usually convert them unless they are a serial underperformer. The likes of Darwin last season, and also in the past, the likes of Gabriel Jesus. There are certain players that historically do underperform, but generally speaking, if a player has pretty good expected goal involvement, the output usually roughly matches that, especially when you look across a larger sample size. So this doesn't, to me, suggest that we should now ignore expected data. It maybe just suggests that it's been a little bit of an unpredictable start, but these are the sort of players that I would maybe consider having in the future, especially if the fixtures do match up. So I said we're going to discuss the midfielders, and this section is going to be much more relaxed than my usual stuff, but I like to experiment with these videos, so let me know down below in the comments, especially if you watch the videos on a regular basis. Would you prefer like the perfectly made graphics, which you're going to see in the next section for Wilson versus Isak, or do you like this kind of live look, more like a live stream where I just talk about some players and my general opinion on them? What I've done is I've gone onto the FPL site and I've built a very standard game week 8 to game week 10 wildcard draft, but removed the midfielders. Now, the reason for that is to just show you that, because I'm going to go through who I think the best midfielders to own are, but just to show you that you're not going to get Salah, Son, Saka, Bruno, all of these players in. So it gives us a bit of a rough idea about the sacrifices we might need to make. So I've gone cheap with the goalkeepers, a relatively cheap defence, which is actually my wildcard defence. And I have, of course, put Erling Haaland and Ollie Watkins in there, along with Archer. So this team would be a 3-5-2 with Haaland in there and then anyone else you want to own. Of course, if you do similar to me, which is drop Haaland, which we'll discuss as the final section of today's video, whether I still think it's viable if you drop Haaland, then of course you can afford a lot more in your midfield. But let's just say that this is roughly what you want, and then you just need to pick your 5 midfielders. What I've done is I've created a watch list on FPL, and if you click on a player, you might not know this, and scroll down, you can click add to watch list, and you can actually build a watch list within FPL. So we're just going to go through sort of the most expensive to the cheapest midfielders that I'm currently considering. And you can see the list next to me. These are pretty much the only midfielders I'm considering. There are players that are omitted here. For example, like Ward-Prowse isn't here, or Doucouré, or Rashford. There aren't any players that you might be considering, but for me, this is pretty much the list. So I'm going to start with Salah. Essential for me. For me, anyway, if I was to pick one player on wildcard at the moment, it would be Salah. If I was to only own one of Salah, Haaland, or Son, it would be Salah. And that isn't based on last week. I said exactly the same before his 15-pointer. For me, Salah's data is exceptional. His consistency is exceptional too. The fixtures are absolutely remarkable. I mean, they've Everton, Forest and Luton in the next 3. Brentford at home isn't a bad fixture. Yes, they've got City away, but then it's Fulham, Sheffield United and Palace. So up until game week 17, the fixtures are great. Remember, Salah will go to AFCON as well, or maybe around 17, maybe 18. You probably wouldn't want to sell him ahead of Manchester United at home. I'm a Man United fan. That is a brilliant fixture for Salah and a terrible one for United. But maybe sort of game week 18 onwards, especially with AFCON coming up, you could maybe look to sell Salah. But for the next 8 or 9 game weeks, I feel like he is an absolutely brilliant option. There's little to dislike about him. The data's there, the fixtures are there, the penalties are there, the minutes are there, the captaincy possibility is there too. I'm just going to put Salah in because for me, it's not an option, right? Yes, ideally you get Haaland, Salah, and maybe a Son in there, which we'll discuss in a second. But if you are to prioritise one, it's Salah. People are going to be asking me, should I take this -4 for Salah? In my opinion, if you aren't playing the wildcard in 10, because you've already played it or because you're saving it and Salah isn't in your team, yes. it is probably worth taking a -4, maybe even a -8 of some kind to get Salah, because in my opinion, over the next 5 or 6 game weeks, he's probably the best captain in at least 3 of them. And in that case, not only is he an exceptional option already, but when you add captaincy onto it, as we saw last week, most people's game weeks were either made or lost by either not owning Salah or owning him, but more importantly, owning and captaining Salah. So I think it's critical to get the best captains wherever you can, if possible. And for me, Salah is in a lot of those weeks. Obviously, Haaland is too, but Salah in particular. So Salah for me is a definite. Son is a really difficult one. So I'm recording this on Tuesday evening, just to timestamp it for you. Son played in an international duty game on the Tuesday. He was limping at half-time. He then came back out in the second half, was still limping, but scored and played the full 90 minutes, but then he was limping again at about 80 minutes. He just looks, in my opinion, incredibly injured. He just doesn't look fully fit. And people disagreed with this when I tweeted about it, so maybe I'm wrong. I don't think he looked fully fit against Luton. I thought he was very, very off the pace. There was actually, I remember, it was either Basuma played a through ball to Son, and he was up against one of the Luton defenders. I can't remember who it was, but he just was nowhere near getting close to the pace of the Luton defender. And that isn't any discredit to the Luton defender, but Son is a quick player normally, and he just didn't look quite at it. And you know, there's just sometimes when players are just walking around and they look like they've got a bit of a limp. I just don't think Son looks fully fit. Now, my hope was that he would get a bit of a rest over the international break. Either he wouldn't go away on international duty or he would get reduced minutes. But sadly, that doesn't look likely. And for me, when you look at the minutes, he's got 71, 79, 78, 68, 75. If he is still struggling, I would expect him to get between 65 and 75 minutes. And whilst that is good for a player, if you're not considering captaincy, when you're looking at a £9.5 million asset, especially considering some of the other midfielders you've got, you probably want to captain Son. So are the fixtures still there? Especially this week, yes, Fulham. But if you look after that, Palace, Chelsea, Wolves, Villa, City, West Ham, Newcastle, are they great fixtures? Not particularly. So for me, Son is a great asset to own, but not essential. Not essential at the moment. But I think I would try to squeeze him in. But if you can't afford it, maybe not so. And now the reason I say maybe I wouldn't desperately try to squeeze him in if you can't, is if it's between Son and Saka, and assuming that Saka is cleared as fit, I would argue that Saka is better to own than Son for this period here, especially considering the game weeks that you can captain him. Remember, in game week 10, yes, you could captain Salah against... Who does Salah have in 10? He's got the Nottingham Forest at home. So yes, you could do that. But Haaland's got Manchester United. Forest aren't a terrible defence. Saka is a genuine captaincy shout in game week 10 against Sheffield United. And then in game week 12 against Burnley, he's a serious captaincy shout. And in game week 13, Salah, Son and Haaland all have pretty tricky fixtures. So I would argue that Saka, or at least an Arsenal attacker, could be a captaincy shout in some of the upcoming game weeks. Now, Saka has been giving away penalties for fun at the moment, which is very frustrating if you own him. He is still Arsenal's first choice penalty taker. And whilst his data isn't great when you remove penalties, it has actually been pretty decent so far this season. We're still looking at about a 0.6, 0.7 XGI, even once you remove the penalty. So Saka is still picking up decent enough data. And I still feel like he's the most nailed Arsenal attacker and the safest captaincy option if you were looking outside those main three. So if it was to come with a slightly injured, reduced minutes Heung-min Son, or what we hope a fit Saka getting significantly more minutes with arguably better fixtures, especially when we look at captaincy, that's when I then say maybe I would go for Saka over Son. So let's leave Son out for the moment. I would say that Salah and Saka are in my best midfield 5 at the moment. I'll discuss Odegaard and Martinelli alongside Saka. Odegaard for me just isn't as good of an option as Saka. I know his returns have been pretty decent. His data's actually not too bad at 0.46 XGI. But you have to remember there is at least one, potentially 2 penalties in there. So once you remove the penalties, his data's really not good, Odegaard. And yes, he is sort of sharing penalties a little bit with Saka. But I'm just not interested. Like, at least Saka carries something outside of penalties. I just don't think Odegaard massively does. So for me, Odegaard's not an option. Martinelli's much more interesting because he's £0.9 million cheaper at the time of me recording. And when Martinelli's fit, he's first choice and his minutes are fantastic as well. I just worry that Arsenal have quite a few options when everyone's fully fit to rotate into that front line. And I just think Saka is just so much more nailed that it may still be worth paying the extra for Saka instead of Martinelli. But Martinelli does interest me. And I may be bringing Martinelli into my own team at some point. So Saka, Martinelli, Odegaard, for me, it's always going to be Saka. Bruno Fernandes is an interesting one. I'm not going to talk about him for long because people hate him. And do you know what? I honestly can't be bothered to keep justifying why I think he's a good option. But it is the 90 minutes. It is the penalties. It is the fixtures. And the data is there. And I think sometimes we confuse football with FPL. Football and FPL are completely separate things. I don't care from a FPL perspective if Manchester United are losing 10-3 every week. If Manchester United are still creating chances, and more importantly, Bruno is still putting up good data, it does not matter if Manchester United look good. It does not matter if Manchester United are not passing the eye test. If Bruno is objectively getting the chance to score goals and creating chances too, more often than not, you would expect him to still get returns. And Bruno is actually demonstrating the best data he has shown since being at Manchester United. Even better than that elite season that he had when he first joined. Bruno's data is remarkable. So that's why I want him. And then when you look at the fixtures like Sheffield United, Fulham, Luton, Everton, in the next 5, if you can bench him against City or just play him and hope he gets a penalty of some kind, they're just such good fixtures. So no, I wouldn't probably try to argue that Bruno is definitely in the best 5 midfielders in FPL. But if you want a differential, because no one owns him at the moment, with 0.69 expected goal involvement and the fixtures that he's got, with the minutes that he's got as well. Look, he's played 90 minutes in every single game and penalties. I still think Bruno Fernandes is an exceptional option. And I think sometimes we struggle to differentiate between actual output and whether that player should have had output based on the data that we can look at. So I think Fernandes is great, but yeah, maybe I myself wouldn't be putting Fernandes in. Maddison's a really tricky one because when I look at Maddison, I think Son is the better asset. Son is a greater goal threat. Son is probably on penalties. And Son is the one with the highest ceiling, right? We've seen it, a 14 and a 20-pointer. Maddison only has 1 double-digit haul, a couple of 9-pointers in there as well. But Maddison's kind of like Watkins. Maddison ticks along very nicely. And I know Watkins got a 23-pointer, but generally Watkins will tick along. Maddison will tick along. They're not players that you can really rely on for captaincy. Like, we've seen nothing from Maddison, and apart from the 23-pointer from Watkins, to demonstrate that these are captaincy options. So that's the real issue. But he is £1.4 million cheaper, and maybe even cheaper than that if you bought him at a cheaper price. So if you want to still have a Spurs midfielder for this run, especially this week against Fulham, looks really nice, and you're not going to go for Son because you're going to try to have Saka in there, I wonder, is Maddison still worth having? Like, yeah, the fixtures aren't there perfectly, but he's at a really nice price point, and you probably do still want a Spurs attacker because under Postecoglou, Spurs are still getting some of the most shots in the Premier League. They're still creating chances, and I'd still expect them to score goals. And yes, Maddison's only ticking along, but he's putting up a 0.67 expected goal involvement. And ticking along isn't a bad thing as long as you can accept that you're not captaining Maddison. As long as you can accept that part, I think it's probably okay. So if I wasn't going to have Son, which we'll discuss in a second whether I still think I would, Maddison may be good to have in there is still having one Spurs attacker. I don't think I would have both at the moment. I think if you're wildcarding in 9 or 10, I don't think you go for a double up on the Spurs attack. You could even argue that you would drop Udogie, by the way. You might not even have Udogie. You may have a Gabriel or a Zinchenko or Saliba in there. So let's say we have Maddison because we don't have Son. I've got Luis Diaz. For me, not really an option because the data doesn't justify the risk on minutes. Darwin, the data justifies the risk. And what I mean by that is when he plays, the data he puts up is so good that it's worth the risk for the lack of minutes that he's likely to get. Diaz needs good minutes because his data is not even that good per 90, that he probably needs the 90 to get some serious output. And what you're seeing from him, 8-7-1-3-1-2-2-2, is kind of probably what you expect based on the data that we're seeing and the minutes that he's likely to get. So it's not that I dislike Diaz. I actually considered him on wildcard, but for me, he's not an option. Bowen is, for me, someone that I would have. And the reason that I love Bowen is the fixtures are remarkable from Game Week 10. Like, really, really nice run here. There are rumours that Bowen is going to be tried as the number 9 with Kudus on the right. And that is obviously going to make him, in my opinion, a slightly stronger asset. Because when you play through the centre, and when you are good at that, and I think Bowen is good at it, you're likely to get more chances to score goals. And the data is there as well. 0.56 non-penalty expected goal involvement because he's not on pens. And similarly to Bruno, he's played 90 minutes in every game. So when I look at Bowen, he's got everything I would want apart from pens, but the data is still strong enough that even without the penalties, I still feel like he'll get attacking returns. So for me, Bowen would probably be in my top 5 midfielders at the moment. The issue is then you've got one spot left for one of Diaby, Matoma, Neto, Gordon, and Hwang Hee-chan. I'll actually go on to the Wolves midfielders. Neto's great. Like, he really is. He's got really decent data. He's now returned in what is it, 5 or 6 game weeks in a row. He had, yeah, since game week 3, he's not blanked. The issue is, he's demonstrating a 0.28 expected assist per 90, which basically means across the first 8 game weeks, he's accumulated 2.3 expected assists, but he's come up with 6 actual assists. So Neto is massively overperforming his expected assists. We would suggest that he would have probably got roughly 2 to 3 assists based on the data. So do I think he'll keep up this rate of creativity and assist threat? No. And does he carry much goal threat? The answer to that is no. So without these slightly, you could call it lucky assist or performing well, the goal threat's not high enough. And if the assists do die off a bit, I just don't see him getting lots of attacking returns. So for me, Neto's just not been an option. I'm not a massive fan of him. Hwang Hee-chan, I'm a little bit more interested in because he's getting a lot of goals. But as you can see, even with Hwang Hee-chan, he is massively overperforming his expected goals at the moment. So do I think Hwang Hee-chan will continue the rate of getting a goal every game at the moment? No. So when I look at these two, are they good budget options? Absolutely. Do I have an issue with them? No. And the fixtures really aren't that bad for Wolves. But do I expect either of them to carry on what they're doing at the moment? I don't. And as a result, I'm not that interested. If I am looking at someone below 6 million, it would be Gordon. The fixtures are still okay. They're not as good as they were a few weeks ago, but they are still okay for Newcastle. And Gordon is a player that is demonstrating some really, really decent attacking threat at 0.47 expected goal involvement. So I do really like Gordon, and I think that if I were to go for someone below 0.6, I probably would be leaning towards Gordon more. But just to say again, his data isn't even that great. I think you have to accept that if you're picking a player below 6 million, they're not going to be a well beater. They're not going to get you attacking returns every single week unless you get pretty lucky. So that leaves basically for this final spot here, and I have 7.2 million, so it's about right budget-wise. I think you pick one of Diaby and Matoma, and I'm not overly opinionated on this. Fixtures from game week 10 onwards, especially if you're wildcarding them for Diaby. Luton, Forest, Fulham, really nice. After that, not so great for Aston Villa. And then Matoma's a similar kind of thing. It's more like a 3 to 4 week horizon here. But I suppose with Matoma, the fixtures are also a little bit better post, and then you've got a nice little run here as well. So maybe a little bit longer term, I like Matoma. I expect both to get reduced minutes because they're both playing in Europe, and I don't expect both to get 90 minutes. We saw Matoma was rested recently. If I was to predict, I would still expect both to start most of their games, and I'd expect both to get attacking returns. In game week 9, obviously Diaby's got the better fixture, and he's not a slight injury doubt, right? Matoma's due to fatigue, but I suppose Matoma's slightly more of a doubt than Diaby, and Diaby's got the slightly better fixture. So in game week 9, I do prefer Diaby, but from game week 10, I'm going to say Matoma. I think if I was putting a game week 10 wildcard together, there is more chance of it having Matoma than there is it having Diaby just about. But then we get into this position where, do I want Diaby instead of a Maddison or a Bowen? Do I still want to try and squeeze Son in? And at that stage, I guess you could. Now, if you wanted to squeeze Son in, as I said, I think it would be instead of Maddison. But then if you've got a similar-ish team to this, you would need to find 0.7, which may not be difficult to do at all, right? If you think Alvarez is still a decent option, you could go for him or Haaland, and then all of a sudden, you've got this midfield. So I would basically argue that that's the best midfield 5, as you can see on your screen. If you can't afford that midfield 5, it's probably Son that makes way for Maddison, and then you might even have a little bit more money to start playing around with. But I think Salah, Saka, Matoma, and Bowen would be probably my top 4 midfielders to choose at the moment. And then it's just that 5th spot. You could even try and squeeze a Martinelli in there and go for the double up on the Arsenal attack. So that is a 16, 17-minute section on the midfielders. But I think it warranted that discussion because it is so important at the moment, choosing the best midfielders. Please do let me know, who is your current midfield 5? Who are you considering, especially if you're on a game week 9 or game week 10 wildcard? Who would be your optimal 5 midfielders at the moment? So 2 players that warrant a discussion around them is Callum Wilson and Alexander Isak, as I said sort of at the start of the video, because these are 2 players that when they play, they are exceptional footballers, but also FPL options as well. And the data that they have consistently put up across the entirety of last season and going into this season as well genuinely turns your head because it is ridiculously good. It's up there alongside the likes of Erling Haaland and Mohamed Salah. The difficulty that we've had is that both have been picking up injuries left, right, and centre. And on top of that, even when they're not injured, if both are fit, they are then still rotation risk because at the moment, at least, it doesn't appear like Eddie Howe wants to, at least on a consistent basis, repeat what we saw last season which is Wilson through the left and Isak, Wilson through the middle and Isak off the left. It looks like it is going to be one or the other. And there doesn't appear to be, probably mainly because of injuries, but there doesn't appear to be a consistent pattern of one playing in the Champions League and one playing in the Premier League. So we are left in a position now of, let's say they are both fit for Game Week 9 and Game Week 10, where we are still finding it very, very difficult to predict who is going to start week by week. Now, fixtures-wise, we spoke about that in the Gordon part in the previous section, but fixtures-wise, it's a bit of a mixed bag, but they are still okay over the next sort of 5 or 6 game weeks. And up until game week 19, really, I don't mind the Newcastle fixtures. But do bear in mind that you did miss 2 of their better fixtures in game week sort of 6 and 7, I believe it was. And actually, this run now, whilst good, Newcastle, you wouldn't say clearly have the best fixtures in the league or anything like that. So you could definitely go without. And if you think they are too much of a risk, that is absolutely fine. But if we do just quickly look at the per 90 statistics, and I'll discuss the issue with this in a second, but let's say that they play 90 minutes. Based on the data that we've seen this season, they are putting up just ridiculous numbers. I mean, we're looking at 9.01 expected FPL points per 90 for Wilson, 7.82 expected FPL points per 90 for Isak. So Wilson slightly edging it. Non-penalty expected goals, 0.97 for Wilson. Do bear in mind that Wilson's on penalties as well. So non-penalty is almost exactly 1. If he plays 90 minutes, on an average game, we are expecting him to get 1 goal. And 0.88 for Isak, which is exceptionally strong as well. Interestingly, this may be the system that they play under Eddie Howe, but there is absolutely zero creativity for the two of them. So 0.03 for both for expected assists. Big chance involvement per 90, 2.42 big chances Wilson is getting per 90. And Alexander Isak, 1.89. So they are both getting around or above 2 big chances per 90 as well. So I wanted to explain why I'm talking about them here, because when they are on the pitch, it is absolutely ridiculous the chances that the Newcastle number 9 is getting. I think that is a combination of the system that Howe is playing, but also how good Wilson and Isak are. The issue that we then run into, if you look at the top of the graphic, is minutes per game. Wilson is getting an average of 37 minutes per game this season. Of course, injuries do play a part. And Isak is getting 67. And this would then bring it to, would I consider Wilson or Isak? No for Wilson due to injuries and also rotation. And when both are fully fit, I am still under the impression that Isak is first choice. Please do correct me down below if you think I'm wrong. But I think if both are fully fit and they have an important fixture coming up in the Prem, I would expect Isak to get the nod and then Wilson to come on for the final sort of 25 to 30 minutes. All of that to say, unless one of these gets injured long-term and is out long-term, I don't think Wilson or Isak get good enough minutes to justify picking them potentially ahead of the likes of an Ollie Watkins or an Alvarez even, who's getting really good minutes at the moment. Because yes, it's great that they're putting up this data, but when you take into account the limited minutes, it's not as good as the data necessarily suggests. And I guess I would never hope for an injury, and I really do hope we don't get one. But from an FPL perspective, that would put us in a position where you could comfortably take the risk on Wilson or Isak if the other one picks up an injury. But as things stand, it's just so tricky. Even if they do have an injury, they're not tending to be long-term injuries, so it's still very difficult. But putting that all together, Isak is still worth considering, because even with the injuries, even with the rotation, Isak is still getting 67 minutes per game on average. And like I said, I do think he's first choice. And the data, whilst it's slightly lower than Callum Wilson, is pretty good. And there is a chance that Isak takes the penalty if Wilson isn't on the pitch too. So there's very little to dislike about Isak if you assume that he's going to start most games in the Prem. And I think at 7.5 million, he is potentially worth the risk, because yes, you've got Watkins, and yes, you've got Alvarez, who's getting decent minutes at the moment. But your other option in and around that price is maybe like a Darwin Nunez. Is Darwin any more nailed than Isak? I would argue not. Yes, he's putting up slightly better data, but Isak also appears to be a little bit more clinical and prolific, and the fixtures aren't bad for Newcastle. So for me, it's just not for me personally. And the reason for that is I think minutes are incredibly important, and I very rarely take risks on players that have poor minutes. Yes, I have with Darwin, but that's slightly different because it's a short-term punt, and his data blows both of these out the water. It is that good. But I don't do it on a regular basis. And for me, I'd much rather go for the Alvarez's and the Watkins, and even the likes of a Solanke, who are on penalties, getting 90 minutes, and the fixtures are there as well. So I don't dislike them. If you're going to go for one, for me, it has to be Isak, because I think he's slightly more nailed. Both have great data. If you do take the risk and you get it right with the prediction of minutes, you are going to be laughing, because they will get you goals when they're on the pitch. We just kind of spoke about him in the previous section, Julian Alvarez. Just wanted to have a quick discussion around him, because he's been pretty consistent with his FPL returns. I mean, he's one of the top point scoring forwards in FPL at the moment as well. His minutes look pretty good and pretty secure still at the moment, even with players returning. But we do know about this difficult run of fixtures, at least on paper, that City have coming up. I mean, I've sold Erling Haaland. A lot of other people are looking to do the same. Does Julian Alvarez require selling? Should we be buying him potentially, or is he more of a hold? I will just say, and I say this as someone that sold Haaland and Wildcard, the next 3 fixtures just aren't difficult remotely. I mean, they are not difficult fixtures. Brighton at home is an exceptional fixture. That should be green. Brighton are not a good defence. Manchester United away, whilst City aren't fantastic away from home, especially against decent defences, and United aren't a terrible defence if you look at the data, it's still not a bad fixture. And then Bournemouth at home is a great fixture. So the next 3 for City aren't bad. And as a result, I wouldn't be looking to sell Haaland in Game Week 9. I wouldn't be looking to sell Alvarez in Game Week 9. I maybe wouldn't even be looking to sell Foden in Game Week 9, especially considering how good his record is against Brighton. And I'm probably not considering it really in Game Week 10 or 11. I suppose there's a small chance I do it in 10, just because I think there are some really nice fixtures that you could attack in that spot. From Game Week 12 to 15... or from game 12 to 14, 15, the fixtures aren't great for Manchester City. And I think game week 12 is a point where you could consider selling Alvarez. But for me, it's just not worth it this week. What I would say is there is a small chance that Alvarez does miss out in game week 9. And the reason that I say that is he is playing on Wednesday morning early. And by Wednesday morning, I mean like Tuesday night, i.e. early hours of Wednesday morning in South America. And then they obviously play on the Saturday. So if he's not back until sort of Thursday, maybe he has Thursday off, it's probably likely that it will be Friday, the first session that Alvarez gets for Manchester City. So there is actually a small chance he misses out in Game Week 9. And if we obviously get news about that, missing it or doesn't start in Game Week 9, then in Game Week 10 against Manchester United away, Chelsea away and Liverpool at home in the next 3 after that. If we get early team news that Alvarez isn't starting, then that makes it slightly different. But let's say that he does get the start against Brighton. The fixtures are there still for me, in my opinion. When we look at his data, it's good, not great. The reason you like it is you have a bit of the attacking City pie outside of Erling Haaland, and that's why it's so exciting. And he is on so many set pieces too, but it's certainly not fantastic data, and this wouldn't suggest to me that he's essential or that you have to keep him. We're looking at a 0.54 non-penalty expected goal involvement, which is really good for 7 mil, and especially when you're looking at getting a nailed City attacker. If City do suddenly start to improve, and they look like the City that we saw at points last season, Alvarez's data might shoot up slightly to the likes of a 0.7 XGI, and then you are looking at an exceptionally good option at 7 million. But at the moment, fixtures are a bit of a mixed bag. Data is average to good. You could definitely justify selling him. I just don't think this is the point. I think if you were looking to sell Alvarez, it was either game week 8 or game week 12, maybe game week 10, but not before Brighton at home, unless, again, we do get some sort of early team news that he's not going to be starting. So let me know down below if you are still sticking with Alvarez. I've got him in my team. It feels like a bit of a hedge against Haaland, that if Haaland does pop off against Brighton, assuming Alvarez is on the pitch, hopefully Alvarez also gets a few attacking returns as well. But I do still like him as an option. I still think he's great, but I certainly don't think he's essential. There were quite a few questions around, I'm at this rank. Is it over for me? Do I give up? What is the new realistic target? And I just wanted to do a bit of a sense check with you that it's really not that bad, right? So just as an example of where I'm at the moment, I did have a very good game week 8, and I will admit that, and there were a lot of things that went right for me. I was at 3.3 million, and as you can see by my head, I'm at the lofty heights of 1.2 million. Not a great rank, I will admit it. I'm at 2.1 million in rank in 1 week. And yes, I'm still not at the rank that I'm happy. But as you can see on the screen, this is from Live FPL, by the way. I'm now 5 points off of 1 million, only 18 off top 500k, and actually off top 100k, I'm only 40. And I say only 40 because in game week 8 alone, I made up 30 points on those around me, roughly, right? If I had one more game week like that, and it's very unlikely that you get those on a regular basis, right? To outscore the average around you by 30 points is quite good. But if I do, I would be up at about 250k. Have another one of those game weeks, and I'm probably looking towards sort of the top 20, top 10k. And again, you can also have bad weeks, and I'm not saying you will regularly have game weeks where you outscore the average by 30, but all you need is one really good week to shoot up the ranks, a couple of other sort of 5 and 10 points above the average weeks, and you're in a really, really good position. And you have to remember, we're not even at game week 9 yet. There are 38 game weeks in a season. right? We're not even a quarter of the way through the season. So do not panic. And it's such a cliche, but rank doesn't overly matter at this stage. Of course, if you're like 5 million, you would much rather be higher than that. But I would argue if you are 4 or 5 million, you could still comfortably finish top 10k. I truly do believe that. The only slight caveat for this season is that there are going to be less doubles and less blanks. And less doubles and less blanks means less opportunities to beat the template and to gamble. Because if we have loads of doubles and blanks coming up, you can take hits, you can be really clever with your chip strategy. The less blanks and doubles, the harder it can be. So I will caveat that, but I still think it's possible because in a single game week, like I said, I made up 2.1 million. If I can do it, anyone can do it. I don't think you want to take massive risks is the thing that I would say. Like I captained Salah. That wasn't a risk. I said all week, Salah, in my opinion, is objectively the best captaincy option ahead of Haaland and ahead of Son. Other than that, yes, I did sell Haaland, and yes, that is a risk. But outside of that, that is mainly the reason that I got such a big green arrow was captaining Salah. And I wouldn't even say you have to force those times to go against the template or to try and take a risk. Like, it will just naturally happen. Salah just naturally happened to be a differential option to own and a very differential option to captain that paid off. And it may not even be with captaincy. There may just be players that at some point you think, I think that player is a great option. For example, I think Bruno is a great option for Game Week 9, which people will massively disagree with. And I love that because it means he'll be even lower owned. And I'm backing myself that I think he is a good option this week. So there will just be times throughout the next 10, 20 game weeks or so, where there will be chances to go against the template, and that's when you take them. I would not be forcing it at this stage. For example, I wouldn't sell Haaland just because of your rank. Like, if you think selling him is great, which we'll discuss in the next section, then go for it. But I wouldn't be forcing stuff at this stage, regardless of your rank, because, as I said, I've gone from 3.3 to 1.2 million. Another good game week, and I'm inside the top 1 million. And all of a sudden, I'm looking at that and thinking, do you know what? That's actually a pretty decent rank to be at this stage of the season. So don't panic. Don't force it. The question that I actually got specifically that forced this, or that made me want to do this section, is someone said, I'm 1.9 million. Do I give up now? Absolutely not. I mean, I was at 3.3 last week and I wasn't giving up. So don't panic. I would love to know down below, what is your rank currently? And do you believe in yourself that you can do it? Because when you look at this, how tightly bunched the ranks are together, 1 or 2 good game weeks can completely change your season. So a very interesting thing to discuss here just to end the video is around Erling Haaland. So if you've not been following my content, maybe this is the first time you've watched me, firstly, make sure to subscribe to the YouTube channel because there will be content throughout the weeks and I'll hopefully guide you through the season and at least hopefully entertain you with my Haalandless draft. But I did sell Erling Haaland on my wildcard last week. The question was, would you do it if you were wildcarding in 9 or 10? Or is it only viable again from game week 12? And I go back to that discussion around Alvarez. The next 3 fixtures are so good for Man City. And I think Haaland is the best captain in 2 of them. Right? I think Haaland is the best captain this week. We'll discuss captaincy in the deadline decisions video probably on Friday. But if I owned everyone, Haaland, in my opinion, is objectively the best captain. I think he's got a great fixture. He's got great data. He's on penalties. The minutes are good. I don't see much of a reason to not captain Haaland this week if you own him. And then in game week 11, I mean, he's got Bournemouth at home. And yes, Salah's got a decent fixture. I think he's got Luton. But that doesn't mean that Erling Haaland's still not the best option against Bournemouth at home. So why would you sell a player that has the best, who is the best captain in 2 of the next 3 weeks? And you might say, well, then why did you sell someone that was the best captain in 2 of the 4 weeks? Well, Arsenal at home was an important fixture, or Arsenal away, I should say, was an important fixture that I wasn't going to own Erling Haaland for. So that was part of my decision making, that in the week that I was wildcarding, I knew that there was a good chance that Haaland might blank in that fixture. So it's not saying that I think that Haaland's going to blank in game week 9 against Brighton. I don't. Or that he'll blank in game week 11 against Bournemouth. I don't. Or that even necessarily he'll blank against Manchester United. What we are banking on is in those trickier fixtures, he won't necessarily get that many returns, which is what we've seen in the past. So against Arsenal, I was hoping he would blank and he did. Against Manchester United, I'm hoping it is limited to a maximum of 1 attacking return. And in the weeks that you back against Haaland, and even in the weeks that maybe people back Haaland, my captain just needs to get close. And the other players that I've been able to select by dropping him, because it's really allowed me to build a strong squad, I need them to also perform. So it's not about me thinking that Haaland is not a good captaincy shout. It's more about me thinking that my team overall across the next 6 to 8 game weeks will outperform the team that I would have put together if I'd have had Haaland in it. And so that's the bet that I'm taking. That is the gamble, and I'm hoping it will pay off. But to answer this question specifically, there's no chance if I was wildcarding this week I would sell him, because you've just had the most difficult fixture. You've got arguably the best fixture this week against Brighton. In 10, it may be slightly more tempting because you've lost the Brighton fixture, but then Manchester United and Bournemouth aren't terrible. From game week 12 to game week 15, I would argue that the fixtures are a little bit weaker for Manchester City. And again, if you are wildcarding on game week 12 or you're using your free transfers, that may be another opportunity to take Erling Haaland out. But I think that now is probably not the time to do it. So if you are wildcarding this week, I would probably have him. I would love to know if you are wildcarding, are you considering going with him? Just to say also, though, he's not been as great as he was last season. There's a slight drop-off in his data, but also a slight drop-off in his output and his performance too. The last couple of weeks, they have been without Rodri, and I do think that is one of the main reasons that Haaland has been struggling. Not only is Rodri so good at controlling the game and dictating the tempo, but he's actually been pretty good going forward as well. And I do think he creates opportunities for those around him. So I think Rodri is a bigger miss than people realise. And with some of the players that they've got returning from injury now, Man City, both in defence and in attack, I wouldn't be surprised to see a bit of an improvement in City's output. So if you've got Haaland, for me, he's the obvious captain. I wouldn't be going without him in game week 9. And I've just got to hope that my Haalandless team can get through what is probably the scariest week. For me, when I look at future weeks and where I not regret going without him, but where I would love to own Haaland, this is a week that I am worried. And I would probably at this stage take a small red arrow because I think in the surrounding weeks, I am really happy backing against him. But this is obviously a week that I'm not happy doing so. So there's a bit of a discussion around Haaland. Of course, we'll continue to discuss him as well, especially if he gets like a hat-trick or 4 goals against Brighton. I'll maybe be sat there with an egg on my face back at 3.3 million. But that is one of the risks that you take, and hopefully it pays off. So guys, there you have it. That is my Game Week 9 preview, hopefully answering most of your key questions around Game Week 9 and including some transfer advice in there as well. If I haven't answered any of the questions that you have ahead of Game Week 9, please do drop them below in the comments, and I'll try to cover anything that I've missed in the Game Week 9 deadline decisions video, which will be out at the end of the week once we get some of the information around the press conferences and updates post-international break. Until next time, thank you very much for watching. Cheers. Bye-bye.